The coldest killer. The ground was dark, cracked, and covered with ash. Smoke rose from broken metal buildings. Fires burned in the distance. This was not Earth anymore. It was a dead colony in space, and no one was supposed to be alive. But someone walked through the smoke, silent like a shadow. Her name was Jera. She was tall, fast, and dangerous. Her silver armor had deep cuts, proof of many battles. Her face was cold, her eyes sharp. She had no emotion, no fear, no mercy. Jera was an assassin, not born, but made. She didn't remember her family. She didn't remember kindness. All she knew was missions. Kill the target. Leave no witnesses, no questions, no feelings. Today's mission was simple. Clear the colony. Eliminate all human survivors. Jera moved through the ruins like a machine. Her boots made no sound. Her weapons were hidden, but deadly. Her black visor scanned every corner. No life signs, yet. But suddenly, a sound. A soft cry. Jera turned her head. Her visor beeped. One life form. Close. She followed the signal, walking past a destroyed transport ship. Something shifted in her chest, but she ignored it. She found a broken building with one wall still standing. Inside, a man was trying to carry a small child. His leg was bleeding. The child looked weak and scared. The man looked up and saw her. He froze. Jera raised her arm. Her weapon locked in place. One shot. That's all it would take. The man didn't run. He looked tired, like someone who had lost everything but still held on to something. Maybe hope. Maybe love. Jera's finger paused over the trigger. Do it, her inner voice said. This is what you were made for. But her finger didn't move. The man didn't beg. He didn't scream. He slowly put the child down and stood between her and the boy. If you want to kill, he said quietly, kill me, but let him live. Jera's mind flashed. A memory, just a flash. A warm hand, a soft voice. Someone once said to her, "You're not just a weapon." She blinked. The image disappeared. What is this? She thought. A trick. Jera lowered her weapon. Just a little. The man reached into his torn bag. Jera aimed again, but he pulled out a bottle of water. He held it out to her. You look tired, he said. Take it. You're not my enemy. Jera stared at him. No one ever spoke to her like that. No one ever offered her kindness. For a moment, everything went quiet. The fires burned, the child coughed, but in her ears, only silence. Jera stepped back. She couldn't understand what she was feeling. Her heart, if she even had one, was beating faster. Her hands, always steady, were now shaking. She turned and disappeared into the smoke. The man didn't follow. As she walked away, her mind spun in circles. This had never happened before. She had let a target go. She had felt something. Back at her hidden dropship, Jera sat alone. The stars above were cold. She removed her helmet and touched the small scar behind her ear. That's where they had put the chip that made her a killer. But today, it didn't work. Jera whispered to herself, "Why didn't I kill him?" There was no answer. Just silence. And in that silence, for the first time in her life, Jera felt afraid. The man who didn't run. The night on the broken colony was silent, but Jera couldn't sleep. She sat inside her cold dropship, her back resting against metal walls, eyes staring at the stars through the window. Her hands were still. Her breath was steady. But her mind, it was not. For the first time in her life, she had walked away from a target. Not because she was ordered to. Not because her weapon failed. But because something stopped her. A human man. He stood in front of a child, ready to die so the boy could live. He offered no fight, no scream, no fear. He even offered her water. Why? She couldn't stop thinking about it. Back when Jara was a child, before the training, before the pain, she remembered something strange. It came in flashes. A woman's voice, a smile, a warm hand on her cheek. That woman had said, "Don't be afraid to feel, little star." But they took that memory from her long ago. Or at least, they tried. Now something inside her had cracked open. Jara closed her eyes. The next morning, the colony was quiet. Smoke still rose from burned-out buildings, but there was something peaceful about the silence, too, like the land itself was breathing again. Jara didn't know why, but her feet carried her back to the ruins. Not to kill, just to see. She moved through the wreckage with the same quiet grace, but this time, she didn't hold her weapon out. This time, she wasn't hunting. She found the building again, the one with the man and the child. They were still there. The man was fixing the small solar panel on the rooftop, his hands rough and bleeding. The child was asleep under a blanket made of old jackets. Jara didn't move closer. She just watched from behind a broken wall. The man looked up. He saw her. This time, he didn't freeze. He nodded, and then he smiled. Not a full smile, just a small one, but it was real. Jara stayed in the shadows. She didn't speak, but she didn't leave either. The man looked at the child, then back at her. "You don't have to be alone," he said. Jara didn't answer. She wasn't ready for that kind of sentence. It felt like a puzzle her mind didn't know how to solve. The man sat down on a piece of rubble and motioned toward her. "I'm Eli," he said. "This is Jonah. He's not my kid, but I found him when the bombs fell. Everyone else ran. I stayed." Jara didn't move. "I used to be an engineer," he added. "Nothing special. I built machines. I fixed things. Until the war came. Then I broke more than I fixed." Jara stepped out from the shadow. Just a little. Still no weapon. Still silent. "I know who you are," Eli said. "Or at least, what you are. The armor. The movement. The cold eyes. You're one of them." Jara's eyes narrowed. But Eli continued, "You didn't kill me. That makes you different." Silence stretched between them. The wind carried ash across the ground. Jara finally spoke. "My name is Jara." Eli smiled again. This time, wider. "Nice to meet you, Jara." She looked at him. Her voice was flat, confused. "Why didn't you run?" Eli scratched his beard. "Running doesn't always save you. I've run before. Lost people anyway. Sometimes, standing your ground is the only choice left." He looked at Jonah. He needed someone to stand for him. Jara sat down across from him, just out of reach. She still didn't fully trust him, but her body felt tired. Tired in a way that wasn't physical. "You should have let me kill you," she said honestly. Eli shrugged. "Maybe. But if I did, I'd be dead. And you, well, you wouldn't be here, would you?" That sentence hit something deep inside her. She remembered the endless training, the voice of her commander. Hesitation is weakness. Kindness is failure. But she had hesitated, and now she was here. Jara looked at Jonah. The child stirred in his sleep. She noticed a small stuffed toy clutched in his arms. It had one eye missing. She didn't know why, but her chest ached a little at the sight. "Why do you help him?" she asked. "Because someone helped me once," Eli replied. "That's how it works, doesn't it? We pass it on, even if the world is burning." Jara looked away. That idea didn't exist in her world. In her world, pain was passed down, not kindness. Back on the alien warship above the colony, a red light blinked. An AI reported back. "Unit ZH-47 has failed to complete the kill order." Her old partner, Ryle, stood beside the commander. "She's compromised," he said coldly. "I'll handle it." Permission was granted. He left at once. Jara stood up. "I shouldn't be here," she said. They'll come. They'll kill all of you." Eli didn't panic. "We already lived through hell," he said. "What's one more day?" Jarrett turned to leave. "I'll come back," she said quietly. "Bring cookies," Eli smiled. Jarrett didn't know what cookies were. But for the first time, she almost smiled too. She disappeared into the mist again. But something had changed. She wasn't just a weapon anymore. Someone had seen her, and she had a name. The Scared Past. Shara had never returned to the same place twice. Assassins didn't look back. They finished the job, disappeared, and waited for the next order. But now she was doing something different. Something wrong. Something human. For 3 nights in a row, she watched Eli and the child from the shadows. She didn't speak. She didn't step into the light. But she stayed close. She didn't understand why. Her instincts told her to move on, to leave, to forget. But her feet refused. Each night, she sat on top of a broken ship, looking down at the crumbling building Eli called home. It was nothing more than bricks and bent metal, yet somehow it felt warmer than any place she had ever known. On the 4th night, the stars were hidden by clouds. A cold wind blew ash into the air. Jera sat still, her armored knees pulled close to her chest. Inside, she was fighting a war. But not the kind with guns or blades. This one was deeper. Inside her mind. Inside her past. She remembered a room. Bright white walls. Children sitting in chairs, their heads shaved, wires attached to their skin. A voice from a speaker above told them the rules. You were chosen to be perfect. Weakness will be erased. Emotions will be punished. Obey or disappear. Jara had been just a child, maybe 5 years old. She had tried to speak once. She had whispered to the girl next to her, asking, "What's your name?" The girl never answered. The next day, her chair was empty. From that moment, Jara had stayed silent. She learned fast, fought harder than the others, showed no fear. They rewarded her by turning her into something sharp, a weapon, an assassin. Her name became a number, ZH-47. Her memories faded, on purpose. They injected something into her brain that buried her past under fog. Faces disappeared. Names faded. But lately, the fog had started to break. Eli's kindness had done something strange, something dangerous. It had cracked the walls inside her mind. Now, pieces of her old self were slipping through. On the 5th night, Jera crept closer. She stood behind a broken pillar, watching as Eli cooked something over a small fire. It smelled strange, but comforting. Jonah, the child, was awake. He played with a metal spoon, tapping it against a rock and laughing quietly. Jera tilted her head. She had never heard a child laugh before. Not during a mission. Not in her memory. Only silence. Always silence. Eli looked up suddenly. He didn't seem surprised. "You're back," he said. Jera stepped forward, careful and slow. "I said I would come." Eli nodded. Hungry. She didn't answer, but her eyes stayed on the food. He passed her a small bowl. She took it with stiff hands, unsure. The warmth surprised her. So did the taste. It was salty and soft. Her mouth didn't know what to do with it at first, but she didn't stop eating. Eli smiled. "It's not much, but it keeps us alive." Jonah walked over, holding out a small piece of metal. "It's a star," he said. "For you." Jera stared at the object. It was just scrap, bent and rusty. But Jonah's little hand was shaking with excitement. She took it slowly. "Thank you," she said. Eli watched her carefully. "You remember anything yet?" he asked gently. Jera didn't answer at first. Then she said, "I think I had a sister." Eli looked surprised. "She had a small bracelet," Jera continued, "made of thread. I think I gave it to her before they took me." She looked at the fire. "They erased her from my mind. but sometimes I hear her voice." Eli stayed quiet. Jera looked at him. Her voice was low. "They took us young, broke us, made us forget. I became what they wanted, but I don't think I was born that way." Eli nodded slowly. "They fear memory," he said, "because memory brings choice." Jera looked down at her wrist, where her armor ended. Just below the skin, near a scar, was a small bump. The chip, the control device, the thing that kept her obedient. "I want it gone," she whispered. "I don't want to be theirs anymore." Eli stood. He walked to a metal box and returned with a small toolkit. "You're sure?" he asked. Jera met his eyes. "No one ever asked me that before." They worked in silence. Jera sat still while Eli cleaned the area, his hands shaking slightly. He wasn't a surgeon, but he had fixed machines before, and now he would try to fix her. The tool cut into her skin. It hurt, more than she expected. But she didn't scream. Not because she didn't feel the pain, but because she chose not to. That was different. That meant something. After a few minutes, Eli pulled out a small black chip covered in wires and blood. Jera stared at it. It looked so small, and yet it had ruled her entire life. She crushed it under her boot. "I'm not ZH-47 anymore," she said. "I'm Jera." Outside, in the night sky, a ship passed through the clouds. It was sleek and fast. Inside sat Ryle, her former partner. His orders were clear. Jera had gone rogue. And now she would be erased, just like all the others. Betrayal of steel. The fire inside the broken colony flickered gently, casting soft orange light across Jera's face. She sat still, staring at the sky. The pain from the wound on her arm, where the chip was removed, had started to fade, but something deeper remained, a strange feeling. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something new. Freedom. For the first time, Jera was not waiting for orders. She was not calculating kill zones or exit routes. She was simply existing. Eli and Jonah were asleep. The boy was curled beside the fire, using Eli's jacket as a blanket. Eli snored quietly, his face finally showing rest after long weeks of stress. Jera watched them like a silent guardian. She didn't realize she was smiling. But above them, in the sky, death was coming. Ryle flew silently through the upper clouds. His ship was smaller than Jera's, faster, equipped with a stealth shield. He landed 3 miles from the colony center. His eyes were cold. His armor blacker than space. He moved like a shadow, just like Jera once had. He had trained beside her, fought with her, killed with her. They were once like twins, made from the same system, programmed to obey without question. But now, Jera was a defect, a failure, a traitor. He touched the control panel on his wrist. Mission code: Reclaim Unit ZH-47 or terminate. Ryle smiled beneath his helmet. He already knew which option he preferred. Jera's instincts twitched. She stood slowly, her senses stretching into the dark. The night felt wrong. Too still. Too quiet. She walked to the edge of the ruins, scanning the empty roads between broken buildings. Then she saw him, a black shape moving without sound. Too fast. Too perfect. Ryle. He stopped 10 meters from her, removed his helmet. His face hadn't changed. Sharp jaw, cold eyes, emotionless. "Hello, Jera," he said. She didn't move. "Ryle, you look different," he said, tilting his head. "We heard you were broken. I didn't believe it at first, but here you are, standing beside humans, eating their food, letting them live." Jera's voice was steady. "I'm not broken. I'm free." Ryle laughed softly. "They always say that, right before they beg." "I won't beg." "I know." There was silence. Rel's smile faded. "You removed the chip," he said. Jera didn't answer. "That's a shame," he whispered, drawing a long blade from his back. "You were one of the best, but you know the rules." Jera stepped forward, her own blade sliding from her wrist. "I know all the rules," she said. "That's why I'm breaking them." Ryle didn't wait. He attacked first, fast, sharp, brutal. Jera blocked the first 2 strikes, but stumbled on the third. Her body was still recovering. She was strong, but he was fresh. Their blades clashed in bursts of sparks, slicing through air and metal. Jera ducked, kicked, blocked, moved with perfect grace. But Ryle matched her. "You feel now," he hissed during a lock. "That makes you weak." "No," Jera breathed. "It makes me dangerous." She spun and slashed. Her blade caught Ryle's side. A deep cut. Blood, real blood, spilled onto the ground. Ryle growled. "You let them in," he shouted. "You forgot who we are." Jera roared back. "I remembered who I was before they turned me into you." The fight exploded. Metal against metal. Flesh against fury. They crashed into a wall, broke through a half-standing building, and rolled into the dust. Ryle tried to stab her through the chest. She twisted and drove her knee into his face. They stood again, breathing hard. Then, Eli's voice. "Jara." Jera turned slightly, just for a second. It was enough. Ryle threw a small energy dagger. It raced toward Eli. Jera reacted instantly. She ran, faster than thought, diving in front of the blade. It struck her in the side. She fell. Eli screamed. Jonah cried out. Rel walked toward her slowly, his blade raised for the final strike. "Goodbye, sister," he said. But Jara, even bleeding, was not finished. She grabbed the crushed control chip from her pouch, the one removed from her own body. She threw it like a dart. It stuck to Ryle's chest, right over his armor's heart sensor. Then she activated it. Rel's body jolted. He dropped his weapon. Electric pulses exploded through his nerves. The old chip, still half alive, sent corrupted signals into his brain. He screamed, a terrible, raw sound. Then silence. He collapsed. Still breathing, but unconscious. Jera fell to her knees. Eli rushed forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Her blood ran down his arms. "You came back," she whispered, looking up at him. "You saved us," he replied, holding her close. Jonah stood beside them, holding her hand. Jera looked at the boy, his eyes wide, full of worry. She smiled faintly. "I'm not like him," she said. Eli nodded. "We know." Later that night, the body of Ryle was tied up inside the old shipwreck. Jera didn't want to kill him. Not yet. Maybe, just maybe, he could change. If she could, anyone could. She sat near the fire again, wrapped in a blanket, her side stitched by Eli's shaking hands. Jonah had fallen asleep beside her. Eli handed her a cup of warm water. Jera looked at it. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "For what?" Eli asked. "For who I was." Eli shook his head. "You don't have to apologize for surviving." Jera looked at the stars. Some were bright. Some were fading. And somewhere out there, others like her still lived in chains. The storm is coming. The wind had changed. Jera felt it in her bones. She stood on top of a broken tower, the highest point in the ruined colony. From there, she could see the world below, twisted buildings, shattered roads, and far beyond, dark shapes moving in the sky, clouds. No, ships. They were coming. Not one, not two, but a full alien fleet. The storm wasn't just in the sky. It was in her chest. Down below, Eli was fixing the old signal tower. The metal frame groaned as he climbed higher, carrying wires and ancient tech parts over his shoulder. The boy Jonah helped however he could, holding tools. pressing buttons, asking questions Jara didn't understand. Jara had told Eli that the signal array was the only chance. If they could power it long enough, it might reach nearby human patrols. But the array was old, built when the colony was still young and hopeful. Now it was broken, forgotten, buried under ash. Just like its people. Jara looked down at Eli, watching his hands move quickly, carefully. He didn't panic, even with death approaching from above. He worked like someone who had already accepted fear and decided to keep going anyway. She admired that. Maybe even invited. She jumped down quietly and joined him. "How long until it works?" she asked. Eli didn't look up. "Hard to say. Power lines are fried. Circuits are cracked. But I think we can make it talk, just once." "That's all we need," she said. He finally looked at her. "You're bleeding again." She shrugged. "It's just blood. Kind of important, don't you think?" Jara smiled faintly. "Not compared to this." That night, the wind grew louder. The sky turned red. Jonah clung to Jara's side, his small hand holding the fabric of her cloak. He didn't ask questions. He just looked up at her with wide, scared eyes. Jara wasn't used to being needed. She didn't know how to comfort him, so she did the only thing she could. She stayed. They sat near a weak fire while Eli worked through the night, connecting the signal tower's ancient core to a portable battery Jara had salvaged from her old dropship. Everything depended on a few sparks of life left in dying machines. Jara watched the stars disappear as the alien ships moved closer. Their shadow covered the sky like a curtain. "I used to think I was part of them," she said softly. Jonah looked up at her. "They trained me to destroy humans, to erase hope. But now, I want to protect it." Jonah leaned his head against her shoulder. "You already do," he whispered. Sometime before sunrise, Eli dropped his tools and wiped his forehead. "It's ready," he said, exhausted. "I can boost a signal for maybe 15 seconds. Then the tower will fry." Jara nodded. 15 seconds is enough. They climbed to the top, where the signal dish still pointed toward the stars. Eli entered the broadcast code, a distress signal once used by colony engineers. "Think anyone's out there?" he asked. Jara looked into the dark. "I think someone is always out there. The question is, will they listen?" Eli pushed the final button. The tower came to life. Old lights blinked. Static screamed from the speakers. Then, the sound of transmission. A burst of code flew into the night sky, carried by a dying machine and a dying world. For 15 seconds, the colony screamed for help. Then silence. The tower sparked once, then collapsed into smoke. Jara and Eli didn't speak. There was nothing else to say. Now, they had to wait. The alien fleet arrived hours later. Dozens of ships circled the sky. They hovered like vultures, watching the ruins below, searching for signs of life. Inside one of the ships, a familiar voice gave the order. "Find ZH-47. Bring her back alive if possible, dead if necessary." Zara saw them from the ground. Her blade was ready, her armor tight against her wounds. She didn't hide anymore. She had something worth fighting for now. Eli stood beside her, holding a salvaged plasma rifle. His hands were steady. Jonah was hidden deep underground. Inside a bunker, Jara had reinforced herself. For the first time since the beginning, they were ready. Not to run, to stand. Together. The first wave came without warning. Small drone scouts, fast and deadly. Jara cut through them like thunder. She moved with rage, with clarity, with purpose. Eli covered her from behind, shooting down anything she missed. They fought like two pieces of one storm. But the real threat hadn't arrived yet. Not until a loud sound echoed through the sky. A command ship descended, landing like a beast on steel legs, and from its dark mouth, more soldiers stepped out, heavily armed. Cold eyes, just like Jara used to be. Her old team. She recognized their faces, even under the helmets. They had trained with her, killed with her, slept in the same cold rooms, followed the same rules. Now they walked toward her like strangers. One of them shouted, "ZH-47, surrender." Jara raised her blade. "I'm not ZH-47 anymore." The soldier aimed his weapon. "Then you are nothing." Eli stepped beside her. "She's more than any of you." The soldiers opened fire. Jara didn't flinch. She charged. The battle raged in the ruins. Jara fought with everything she had. Pain screamed through her body. Her side was still wounded. Her arms ached. But her heart beat stronger than ever. She didn't fight to kill. She fought to protect. Every blow she gave, every strike she blocked, was for Jonah, for Eli, for the girl she used to be before they turned her into a ghost. Above the colony, far beyond the clouds, a human patrol ship caught a strange signal. It was old, weak, but it was clear. A colony signal, a cry for help. The captain gave the order. "Set course, full speed. We're bringing them home." Heart over code. Jara's body was broken. Her armor was scratched, torn at the side where the blade had entered hours ago. Blood ran down her leg. Her breathing was shallow, and her left arm barely moved. But her eyes were full of fire. Across from her, the final squad of black-armored soldiers stood like statues. They looked just like she used to. Emotionless, silent, cold, except they weren't her anymore. She had chosen her name. She had chosen her side, and she would fight for it until her last breath. Eli stood behind her, bleeding from his forehead, holding the plasma rifle with trembling hands. He had never fired a weapon before this week. Now he was counting every shot like his life depended on it. Because it did. And somewhere below, in the underground shelter, Jonah waited. He was small, scared, but not helpless. Jara had taught him how to lock the door, how to stay quiet, how to believe in something stronger than fear. The lead soldier stepped forward. His voice was mechanical, coming through a voice modulator. "ZH-47, you have disobeyed. You have removed your chip. You have betrayed your creators." Jara straightened. "My name is Jara, and I wasn't created by you. I was stolen." He lifted his weapon. "Return now, or be terminated." Jara lifted her blade with both hands, ignoring the pain that flared through her side. "I'd rather die free than live as your tool." The fight began like lightning. Blasters fired. Blades clashed. Dust and heat exploded across the battlefield. Jara moved like wind through fire. Her mind wasn't thinking. It was knowing. Every movement was survival. Every strike was purpose. She ducked under one blade, slid across broken ground, and took down the first soldier with a sharp kick to the neck. His helmet cracked. He dropped. But another came. Then another. One caught her arm, her bad arm. She screamed but kept fighting. Eli covered her from above, firing round after round. He took down 2 soldiers before his weapon overheated. Then he jumped into the fight with nothing but a metal pipe. Jara didn't have time to stop him. They fought side by side, not as soldier and civilian, but as equals, as people who refused to give up. Halfway through the fight, Jara was thrown back. She crashed into a wall, her head hitting stone. For a second, the world turned black. The sounds of war faded, and in the dark, a voice came. Not from outside, from deep within. A memory, a small voice. "Jara, come home." She saw her younger self, sitting on a bed, holding a thread bracelet. Her sister was there, maybe 6 years old, smiling with missing teeth and big eyes. "When you're scared, just touch this. It means you are still you." The bracelet was blue and red. Simple, but it meant everything. Jara blinked. She touched her wrist, her real wrist, where the bracelet should have been. And then she stood. The final soldier stepped forward. He was huge, 2 meters tall, more machine than man. His armor was thicker, sharper. His hands had built-in plasma blades. He looked like the future of war. But Jera was something else. She was the past reborn. And she had a heart. They clashed hard, metal screaming, sparks flying. Her blade cracked against his armor again and again. He struck her leg. She fell, but rolled away. He tried to stab her chest. She twisted, elbowed his jaw, kicked him in the back. Eli screamed something, but she couldn't hear it. All she saw was the enemy in front of her, and the future behind her. She had one chance. Jera waited until the soldier raised both arms to strike. Then she ran forward. Not away. Forward. She slid under him, rolled to her knees, and drove her blade into the only weak spot she saw, just under the helmet, at the neck. It sank deep. The soldier dropped. Jera collapsed beside him. Everything went quiet. Eli ran to her. Jera. Her body wasn't moving. She was breathing, but weak. He cradled her in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open. "You're alive," he whispered. She smiled faintly. "So are you." He laughed, crying at the same time. Jonah ran out of hiding and hugged her legs. "You saved us," he said. Jera coughed, wincing. "I didn't save you. You gave me something to fight for." Suddenly, the ground shook. They looked up. From above, the sky opened. 3 large human ships descended. Bright blue lights lit the ground. Help had arrived. The signal had worked. The fleet circled overhead, scanning the ruins. Searchlights swept the ground. Soldiers dropped in armored suits. A voice crackled through a loudspeaker. "Stand down. You're safe now." Jera closed her eyes. The war inside her was over. Later, in the human medical bay, Jera lay on a real bed. She had stitches in her side. Her arm was bandaged. Tubes ran from her body to machines that beeped softly. Eli sat beside her, holding her hand. Jonah slept in a chair nearby. Jera opened her eyes slowly. Eli leaned in. "Hey." She blinked. "Did we?" He nodded. "You saved us. You saved yourself." Jera looked at the ceiling. "Do they know who I am?" "Yes," Eli said. "But they don't see you as an enemy." She sighed. "I still have to face what I did." "You will, but not alone." Jera turned her head. "What if they ask me why I changed?" Eli smiled gently. "Tell them the truth." She squeezed his hand. "I felt something stronger than code. Home is not a place." Jera stood at the edge of the landing platform, the wind pulling gently at her short hair. Behind her, the ruins of the colony lay silent. No more fire, no more screams, just wind, dust, and the echo of what had been. Ahead of her, the human fleet stretched across the sky. Ships hovered like steel angels, engines humming with power, waiting to carry survivors away. But Jera wasn't sure she wanted to leave. Not yet. So much had changed in just a few days. She had fought her creators, broken her code, blood for strangers, and found something she never thought she'd have again. A sense of belonging. The medical bay was quiet. Eli sat beside Jonah's bed, telling him stories in a low voice. The boy was recovering quickly, physically, at least. His spirit had always been strong. Jera entered slowly, her steps lighter now, though her body still ached. Eli looked up and smiled. "You should be resting," he said. She shrugged. "I rest when I sleep. I wanted to see you both." Jonah sat up, grinning. "Did you bring me anything?" he asked. Jera reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of metal, a piece of her old blade. She had shaped it into a star. "Your very own constellation," she said, handing it to him. Jonah beamed and hugged her tightly. Jera held him close, feeling something in her chest that had no name, but it was warm, and it was real. Later, on the main deck of the command ship, Jera met with Captain Rice, the human officer in charge of rescue and recovery. He was an older man with tired eyes and a sharp mind. He had read her files. He knew who she used to be. He looked at her across the long metal table and said, "You were trained to destroy us." Jera didn't deny it. "But you saved 2 civilians. You fought off an elite squad. And you sent the signal that brought us here." Jera stayed silent. Rice leaned forward. "Why?" Jera took a breath. "I remembered who I was before they erased me. I remembered what it meant to care. And I found people worth fighting for." Rice studied her for a long time, then nodded. "I won't lie to you. Some won't trust you. Some will see you as a threat." "I know," she said softly. "But I see a soldier who broke free of the system. That makes you dangerous to them and valuable to us." Jera frowned. "You want to use me?" "No," Rice replied. "I want to offer you a choice. Not an order. Not a mission. Just a chance." Jera looked out the window, where the stars stretched endlessly. "Not a weapon," she whispered. "Just a person." Rice nodded. "Exactly." That night, Jera stood alone outside the ship. The stars above were brighter now. Maybe because she was finally looking at them with her own eyes, not through a visor, not through a mission lens. Just her. Eli walked up beside her, quiet as always. "You thinking of leaving?" he asked. Jera nodded. "There are others like me. Still out there. Still under control. I can't forget that." Eli didn't argue. "You could stay," he said gently. Jera looked at him, really looked. "I want to," she said. He smiled, but it didn't hide the sadness in his eyes. "But," he asked, "but I have to go. If I don't, no one else will." Eli reached into his bag and pulled out something small, a red and blue thread bracelet. "I found this in your ship. You dropped it." Jera froze. It was old, faded, but still whole. Her sister's bracelet. She took it with shaking fingers, holding it like a heartbeat. "Thank you," she whispered. She tied it to her wrist. The next day, she walked to the shuttle that would take her to the edge of the galaxy. Jonah ran up and hugged her legs again. "Will I see you again?" he asked. Jera kneeled down and placed a hand on his cheek. "Yes," she said. "When the stars are clear, I'll be under the same sky." Eli stood behind him, hands in his pockets, trying not to look like he cared too much. But he did. Jera hugged him too. Tight, fast. "I don't say this often," she whispered, "but you saved me more than I saved you." He smiled. We saved each other. She boarded the shuttle. The doors closed. As the engines lit up and the ship lifted off, Jera looked out the window one last time. Eli and Jonah grew smaller in the distance. She touched her bracelet. A piece of her past. A promise to the future. Weeks later, far from the colony, in a hidden facility orbiting a frozen moon, Jera stepped into a dark room. A child sat alone, wires in her arms, eyes wide with fear. Jera walked up slowly. The child flinched. Jera kneeled and offered her hand. "You're safe now," she said softly. "I'm here to help you remember your name."